Hello, I'm Jennifer Gidley and I'm speaking to you from Australia. I'm delighted to be a guest speaker at the MyzTech conference, Transmuting Technology. Thank you, Andrew Linnell, for the invitation. My talk is about contrasting human futures and the myth of Techno-Transhumanism. Humanism or transhumanism? That's basically what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to cover three main areas in this presentation. Firstly, transhumanism, posthumanism and Superman from the Technotopian futures perspective. Secondly, transhumanism, Superman and conscious evolution from a human-centered futures perspective. And thirdly, I'm going to be looking more deeply at the humanistic phases of conscious evolution or evolution of consciousness. And these three areas involve cultural evolution, psychological development, and the futures of the body. First, I want to make a distinction between enhancement and advancement. The Technotopian transhumanists use the term human enhancement. On the other hand, humanists talking about transhumanism refer to human advancement. So an overview of Technotopian enhancement. It's about human enhancement via technology, biology or genetic manipulation. It also goes by the name transhumanism, posthumanism, Superman, sometimes singularity, which we'll talk about too. There is a huge scientific emphasis and much research dollars spent today on artificial intelligence, robots, cyborgs, brain-computer interface, and artificial superintelligence or ASI, and the singularity. An overview of human advancement. And by human advancement, we mean via culture, psychology, and physical. Also, I use the terms conscious evolution or evolution of consciousness for human advancement. It appears in the following three domains of research: cultural evolution or cultural history research. Secondly, adult developmental psychology research, speaking about higher adult reasoning. And thirdly, futures of the body or superhuman powers research. So beginning with part one, Technotopian enhancement. I hope you like that picture. I thought it was wonderful. A Technotopian futures view of transhumanism, posthumanism and Superman. Transhumanism in the 21st century is a very high-tech business. There are a lot of people making an awful lot of money in Silicon Valley and elsewhere on these high-tech developments in so-called human enhancement. Cyborg, there's the cyborg or human-machine interface. Singularity refers to human functionality technologically advanced exponentially until there's a convergence of human-machine. Posthumanism or enhanced superhumans, and concepts like neural lace, where the brain merges with AI. These are mostly science fiction, but they attract an awful lot of dollars, billions of dollars of research funding. Firstly, cyborg, a kind of human-machine interface. Meet Neil Harbisson. Has anyone heard of him? He's a Catalan-raised British-born artist and cyborg activist. He has an antenna implanted in his skull, and he's officially recognised as a cyborg on his passport by the Catalan government. His antenna is used to perceive visible and invisible colours, such as infrareds and ultraviolets via sound waves, interestingly. In 2010, Neil co-founded the Cyborg Foundation. Now let's look at singularity. I believe it's a Kurzweil fiction. Ray Kurzweil is a key proponent of the singularity hypothesis. He's a Google engineer. His singularity means the point where humans merge with machine. The idea has been around since the 1950s, but Kurzweil is one who's popularised it through his book, The Singularity is Near, and his Singularity University. What he says is the singularity is when our intelligence becomes trillions of times more powerful than it is today and increasingly non-biological. However, I believe the posthuman that transhumanists imagine today is not unlike the Superman trope of the 1930s. We've had a century of techno-utopianism and science fiction. I believe posthuman is as much science fiction as Superman ever was. The Singularity University leverages rapidly accelerating technologies, including AI, nanotechnology, robotics, and digital biology, or hacking your body. Here's a picture of an augmented human, apparently with these robotic arms, looking a bit like he's doing a a Mr. Smith in the Matrix, and here's our good old Superman. Interesting. Also, here's the Singularity University logo on the left, and what's that on the right? The Superman logo. If we needed any further convincing that the Singularity University has a Superman fetish. The Machine Intelligence Research Institute, one of the most prestigious institutes for research into machine intelligence, it states, even human equivalent general intelligence is still largely relegated to the science fiction shelf. So, in my view, it's not going to happen, in spite of all the hype and hubris and all the money being spent on it. Elon Musk has an idea of a neural lace. It would be a digital layer above the cortex. He says we wouldn't necessarily require brain surgery for implantation. Hardware could be injected into our jugular, travel straight to the brain through the bloodstream. Lots of research dollars being spent on this. It's not my idea of human futures. What about you? An Australian neurologist, Thomas Oxley, says the field of brain-computer interface, or BCI, is now taking centre stage in Silicon Valley, one of the next great endeavours. Here's an interesting imaginary of what we might feel like if that happened to us. However, in spite of all this, what I find pretty scary and horrifying news from the high-tech industry, not the least because so much money is being spent on it when we have other very pressing issues on the planet, such as climate crisis. However, there's an ethical turn happening. I see signs that Silicon Valley is unravelling. There are IT experts claiming AI is not intelligent. There are former IT gurus forming institutes for humane technology. Former IT staffers beginning to create calm technology. And believe it or not, Silicon Valley tech gurus sending their children to Steiner or Waldorf schools. I'm increasingly seeing statements being made by very experienced high-level former Google employees and so on, saying AI is not intelligent. Here's Meredith Whittaker, former Google employee. She led the Google walkout in 2019, which was as a result of not just the sexual harassment and lack of diversity in Google, but their decision to link with DARPA, the Defence Force Research Centre, for basically creating lethal autonomous weapons of war. She tried through memos, was unsuccessful. She eventually led a walkout. Google eventually decided to drop that partnership. Meredith says it's very clear to anyone who works with these AI systems that they aren't intelligent. They just process huge amounts of data, and from that data, they build a model of the world. So I would argue that AI cannot in any way create the future or even have a place in the future, because they are simply working with aggregated data from the past. Nothing new or creative there. Next we have Kate Crawford. She's an Australian IT researcher, has been very involved in Microsoft research, and she's just written a book, it's only just been released, called The Atlas of AI. She says AI is neither artificial nor intelligent. I can't tell you much more because I've got the book on order. It's only just been released and I'm waiting for it to arrive. She and Meredith Whittaker have founded something called the AI Now Institute, which is now attached to the New York University, I believe. Here's Tristan Harris. He's called the closest thing Silicon Valley has to a conscience. He founded the Center for Humane Technology in San Francisco. He coined the term human downgrading, the combined negative effects of digital technology on people and society. He's doing a lot of very good work through his center. We have Amber Case, high-level IT from Harvard, who is addressing the fact that the current versions of IT platforms are basically creating so much distraction, addiction to distraction. So she's creating what she calls calm technology. And finally, we have Steiner Education in Silicon Valley, where employees of Silicon Valley giants like Google, Apple, eBay, Yahoo, and many others are sending their children to Steiner Waldorf schools. This is the Waldorf School of the Peninsula in the heart of Silicon Valley, where tech gurus keep their kids away from computers. You see, they all know, these developers all know, that what they've done is deliberately put addiction and distraction into the platforms, into their technologies, so that children will become addicted and they will become constantly distracted, so they will need more and more and more. But they knew that, so they want their children to be kept away from technology. Thank goodness for Steiner schools. This is a summary now of part 1, Technotopian enhancement. It involves technological, biological and genetic enhancement of humans and is very related to artificial machine intelligence. In my view, the transhumanist ambition to create future techno-humans is anti-human and anti-evolutionary. Not to mention, it's science fiction. But the ethical turn is emerging. Now, beginning part 2, what I call humanistic advancement. So this is the Maslow's hierarchy, as I'm sure you'll all know, where physiological needs, safety needs, love and belonging, esteem, all of these have to be met, and then we can begin to self-actualize, which is another word for human advancement or conscious evolution. So now we'll have a human-centered futures view of transhumanism, superhuman, and conscious evolution. You may not know, but the term transhumanism was originally in the 20th century a humanistic ideal. In 1950, Teilhard de Chardin published an article, From the Pre-Human to the Ultra-Human, The Phases of a Living Planet, in which he speaks of some sort of transhuman at the ultimate heart of things. His concepts of ultrahuman and transhuman were evolutionary concepts linked with humanistic and spiritual futures, not high-tech, which didn't exist in those days. Then we have Sir Julian Huxley, who wrote a piece called Transhumanism in 1957. Ironically, today's transhumanists refer to it for the coining of the term transhumanism. But they're wrong, because Huxley's transhumanism was inspired by his friend Teilhard de Chardin, who was writing, as we said, about spiritual humanism, and also Huxley's own evolutionary humanism. Huxley was a biologist and humanitarian and was the first DG of UNESCO in 1946. Huxley's transhumanism also put forward the notion of planetary evolution, along the lines of Teilhard de Chardin's notion of planetization of mankind. We also recall French philosopher Edgar Morin and his planetary era that we are in now, he claims. Huxley also promoted the 18th century concept of conscious evolution, which originated among the German idealists such as Schelling, and it's re-emerging today among integral evolutionary theorists. Teilhard de Chardin and Huxley's planetization is very different from what we call globalization today, which is basically a geopolitical and economic concept of business taking over the world, taking over the culture. It's not a cultural concept, as de Chardin's was. Now I'm going to talk about the origins of Superman. The idea of human beings evolving superhuman powers is not new. I learned from Rudolf Steiner that the origins of this concept goes back to Paracelsus, also known as Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, the Swiss physician, alchemist and Renaissance man. Speaking of the animal world, what Paracelsus said was, "I carried all that within myself and cast it out from my own being." Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in 1883 about the Übermensch, translated as Superman, ultrahuman or higher purpose. His ideas integrated Darwin's biological evolution with the German idealists, writings on evolution of consciousness, and his own ideas on freedom. What Nietzsche said, according to Steiner, was that the animal bore man in itself. Must not man bear within himself a higher being, the Superman? And then we have Henri Bergson, who wrote in 1907 about the Superman in his book Creative Evolution. And it was Steiner who said that Bergson was actually drawing on this earlier lineage of Nietzsche and even Paracelsus. So what Bergson said was, it is as if a vague and formless being, whom we may call Superman, has sought to realize himself and had succeeded only by abandoning a part of himself along the way, the animal world and even the vegetative world. So in parallel with the efforts of Nietzsche and Bergson, Rudolf Steiner himself articulated his ideas on evolving human-centered futures. Steiner's concepts of the evolving human being, such as spirit self and spirit man, emerged in his Evolution of Consciousness writings from 1904 till his death in 1925. Steiner also, as we all know, founded an education system after the Bildung style of holistic human development. During the same period, Indian political activist and philosopher Sri Aurobindo was writing in India about the overman as a consciously evolving future human being. Sri Aurobindo's integral evolutionary work drew from both the ancient Hindu texts and German idealist philosophy. He also helped found an education system after the Bildung style of holistic human development. So now to summarise part 2 of human advancement. Transhumanism was not invented by 21st century technotopians. Its lineage is spiritual humanism and planetisation from Teilhard de Chardin, and evolutionary humanism and conscious evolution from Sir Julian Huxley. Secondly, Superman did not begin as a comic strip, nor was it a technotopian invention of Singularity University. Superhumans have a long lineage from Paracelsus through Nietzsche, Bergson, Steiner, Aurobindo, and many more into the future. So now we're beginning part 3 of humanistic advancement. How do we advance as humans in a human-centred way? This is related to evolution of consciousness and conscious evolution. So there are 3 parts to this: cultural evolution, psychological development, and futures of the body. Cultural evolution. Humans have evolved culturally over millennia. The evolution of consciousness from the 18th to mid-20th centuries began with the German idealists, particularly Goethe and Schelling, in the 18th century. 19th century evolution was hijacked by Darwin, and views of evolution were simply considered to be biological, nothing spiritual, nothing about consciousness. In 20th century Europe, Steiner from 1904 and then Sri Aurobindo from 1914 began to write extensively about evolution of consciousness and higher humans. Then from the mid-20th century we had Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, as I've mentioned, and Jean Gebser, who we'll discuss more now. Then in the late 20th to 21st centuries, we have the contemporaries. We have integral theorists such as Ken Wilber, adult developmental psychologists such as Jan Sinnott, transdisciplinary theorists such as Ervin Laszlo, and futures researchers and psychologists such as myself. Cultural evolution from the point of view of Jean Gebser. Jean Gebser was a Polish-Swiss cultural historian, probably one of the most important cultural historians of the 20th century. He wrote an amazing book, The Ever-Present Origin, which details his discoveries, his research. He describes 5 stages of consciousness, although he referred to them as mutations, not stages. Archaic in prehistory, magic consciousness from the Ice Age to the Agrarian, mythical consciousness from the Agrarian to 800 or so BC to the beginnings of the Greek philosophers, and then mental rational mode from that time until around 1500 CE or the Renaissance. Gebser then identifies what he calls integral consciousness, which he says began in the time of the Renaissance, roughly, and has been continuing on in leading-edge individuals and will continue on way into the future. The most important thing we need to know from Gebser is that in our current cultural era, we are in transition between the dominance of mental rational thinking, or formal binary logic, and the emergence of more complex, creative, integrative, or post-formal logics. Now we're looking at psychological development. But to understand post-formal psychology, which is a new stage of psychological development, we need to begin with Piaget's developmental psychology. This is part 3, Evolution of Consciousness, Psychological Development. Jean Piaget is pretty well known as one of the most important psychologists in the 20th century. His seminal book, The Child's Construction of Reality, was where he talked about the 4 stages of cognitive development in childhood: sensory motor in infant, pre-operational, age 2 to 6, concrete operations 7 to 12, and formal operations 12 to 18. But Piaget stopped there. While he pointed in a couple of places in his writings to there seems to be something more, he never expanded on this. This was left to psychologists towards the end of the 20th century, particularly in the US, Harvard and elsewhere, who wrote about higher stages of adult development in mature adults, and they called this post-formal reasoning. So the most important thing we need to know from Piaget is that today advanced individuals are in a psychological transition between the dominance of formal thinking or formal operations or binary logic and the emergence of more complex, creative, integrative or post-formal logics. Now bear in mind that the whole IT industry, all programming, is built on binary logic. So if we are relying on binary logic, it's going to be very difficult to move beyond that into post-formal logics when it comes to artificial intelligence, for instance. Psychological development, higher development. I want to introduce Jan Sinnott. She is an important adult developmental psychologist of the 20th and 21st century. She wrote the book, The Development of Logic in Adulthood, Post-Formal Thought and Its Applications in 1998. She, among others, recognised that there are higher stages of human reasoning, which they called post-formal reasoning, and there are other names, but I won't go into those here. Post-formal reasoning includes qualities such as complexity, creativity, paradox, reflexivity, relativism, spirituality, and wisdom. I have a chart here which I developed as part of my doctoral research on evolution of consciousness. I don't know if any of you know, but I did my PhD on evolution of consciousness drawing on Rudolf Steiner's writings, Ken Wilber's writings, and looking through the lens of Jean Gebser's structures of consciousness. I looked at all the features, qualities, aspects that these adult developmental psychologists had identified, and I distilled it down to 12 qualities, which I call post-formal reasoning qualities. And here's a list of those there, a chart. You'll be able to keep this PowerPoint. So in summary, evolving culture and psychology as facets of evolution of consciousness, we need to draw from Gebser, Piaget and Sinnott to get a good picture. Jean Gebser's 5 structures of consciousness, archaic, magic, mythical, mental and integral, match up very nicely with Jean Piaget's 4 cognitive stages, sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operations and formal operations. But Gebser's integral consciousness is missing in Piaget's model. So what we need to do there is look at adult developmental psychology, the work of Jan Sinnott and others, for post-formal operations or post-formal reasoning. So now I'm going to look at the third part of the evolution of consciousness, futures of the body. This takes us to Esalen Institute in California, and Michael Murphy, who is the founder of the institute and currently emeritus chair, he's still alive, thankfully, and he's 90 years old and still working very strongly. He's the author of 4 novels and 5 non-fiction books, including The Future of the Body. The Future of the Body is his seminal work that I draw on for this part of the evolution of consciousness work. He speaks about supernormal perception, supernormal cognition, supernormal movement, supernormal vitality, and spiritual development. So Murphy's book, Futures of the Body, is a collection over 40 years of more than 10,000 studies of individual humans who've demonstrated supernormal capabilities. So this is superhuman powers of human beings, not enhanced by technology. And if we contrast a very advanced human gymnast, such as we see here, with Google's clumsy robot, which is about the best Google's been able to do so far with its superhuman powers, creating a robot that can jump a fence while it crashed into the fence. Murphy's book gives examples including such diverse individuals as Catholic mystics, Sufi ecstatics, Hindu Buddhist siddhis, martial arts practitioners and elite athletes, all of whom have demonstrated supernormal experiences. Murphy says, and I really like this saying, these reflect the developing limbs and organs of our evolving human nature. And I want to contrast that with what Marshall McLuhan said in the 60s. Every advance in technology is an atrophying of human capacity. These bear some thought. To summarise humanistic advancement, superhuman capabilities do not require technological, biological or genetic manipulation. Superhuman capabilities are a human birthright. They can be cultivated through cultural, psychological and physical education and discipline. So we're at a critical point today in research into human futures where 2 divergent streams show up. Which one will you choose? For your conference next year, would you like to have a robot, a technologically enhanced robot, or someone like me who works on humanistic advancement? So a few more words about human-centred futures, just to summarise and round off. It's humanitarian, philosophical and ecological. Humans who are developing as human-centred people are compassionate, just, consciously evolving agents of change, responsible for ecological balance between humans, Earth and cosmos. What is required is active psychological, cultural, aesthetic and spiritual development, and we need to be committed to bettering earthly conditions for all humanity through education, cultural diversity, greater resource parity and, of course, respect for future generations. Techno-topian futures, in summary, in my view, are de-humanizing, scientistic and atomistic. They're based on a mechanistic, behaviourist model of the human being with a very thin cybernetic view of intelligence, which is binary. The transhumanist ambition to create future techno-humans is anti-human and anti-evolutionary, in my humble opinion. Technotopian futures is the technological, biological and genetic enhancement of humans. They are developing artificial intelligence, or trying to compete with humans. And then there are the transcendental dreams of abandoning Earth to build a fantasized techno-heaven on Mars or in satellite cities in outer space. I wonder if we'll look after those any better than we've looked after our Earth and our ocean. So the direction we choose for the future will also decide Earth futures. Satellite cities on Mars or regeneration of Earth and ocean. Because Earth has a dual role as home for humans and habitat for life in general. That's the end of my presentation, but if you want to do any further reading, I've published Post-Formal Education, A Philosophy for Complex Futures, which is the educational part of my PhD on evolution of consciousness. Essentially what this is about is if, in fact, consciousness is evolving, as we've seen in all of this research I've pointed to from cultural evolution and adult developmental psychology and futures of the body, then how should we be educating children? That's what this book is about. Next, there's my Oxford book, The Future, A Very Short Introduction. It talks about a lot of things to do with the future. It introduces the future studies field. I certainly deal with the issues that I've talked about today in this presentation, contrasting human-centred and technotopian futures, and I also address the grand global futures challenges, and most importantly, climate crisis, which is the biggest challenge we're facing in the world today, I believe. And finally, my book, The Secret to Growing Brilliant Children, Steiner Education for the 21st Century. It's a collection of my published articles, book chapters, refereed journal articles that I've published over the last 20-odd years, which involved my efforts to bring Steiner thinking, Steiner philosophy and pedagogy into conversation with the leading contemporary research on psychology, education. So that's what that book is about. It was published last year. Thank you very much for watching and listening.